What's up, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Clockwolf. Oh! And welcome to my review for Death's Door, a top-down hack-and-slash action-adventure game that was published by Devolver Digital and developed by Acid Nerve. It was created using the Unity engine and released for PC, Steam, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X on July 20th, 2021, and released later for the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 5 on November 23rd, 2021. This video will show some light gameplay spoilers while avoiding spoiling anything major. So if you haven't played this game before and you're worried about it being spoiled for you, you probably won't miss out on too much by watching this video. Acid Nerve's previous game was Titan Souls, which was released on April 14th, 2015. I have a video on Titan Souls as well. You don't need to watch it before watching this video, but if you want to watch it, there will be a link down below. I am personally glad that I played Titan Souls before playing Death's Door. Not only because the act of 100%ing the game was enhanced greatly by doing so, but I got to fully appreciate how much Acid Nerve had learned in the time between developing Titan Souls and developing Death's Door. The things Titan Souls did weren't particularly original, and the few things it did that felt original weren't executed as elegantly as they could have been. There's nothing particularly original about Death's Door either, but it still manages to execute its unoriginal ideas in an original way. What's interesting is that I think Death's Door is a much better game than Titan Souls, for the very simple fact that well-worn ideas that are executed well will always make for a more enjoyable experience than one half-baked, somewhat original idea that's mostly propped up with its art direction. Although the art direction of Death's Door is nothing to sneeze at either. Don't let the black and white area at the start of the game fool you. At the beginning of the game, your character, whom the game calls the Foretold Crow, arrives at a place called Reaper HQ, aka the Hall of Doors. You work at a company who's tasked with reaping souls and bringing them into the afterlife. Today is your first day on the job, and for your first assignment, you're tasked with retrieving the soul of a demonic forest spirit. Naturally, the job goes wrong, and you lose the assigned soul you were sent to retrieve. You attempt to track it down and eventually find someone who tells you that the soul you're looking for is behind a door with an extremely powerful seal. The only way to open the door and retrieve the specific soul you need to complete your assignment is to find 3 more souls that can be used as keys. This will lead you on an adventure across this game's world to retrieve the keys. This general plot summary may sound familiar if you've played the Souls series or the Legend of Zelda series of games before. Death's Door does in fact take clear inspiration from Dark Souls and The Legend of Zelda. This isn't me just speculating either. The developers have said in interviews that 2 of their biggest inspirations were The Legend of Zelda and Dark Souls. Those weren't their only inspirations, but they were clearly some of the biggest ones. Death's Door has the same thematic notes as Dark Souls, with the heart of the story being centered around the idea of life, death, undeath, and how no life can hide from encroaching mortality forever, not even a god. It pairs that with the silly, lighthearted, adventurous tone and mood of a Zelda game. These elements could have clashed horribly, but Death's Door manages to bring them together in a very natural way. I think the best way I can demonstrate how these elements work so well together in the story without spoiling all of it is by simply showing you one of the best characters in the game. You can tell from the way he speaks throughout the game that Pothead was likely inspired by Sigmire, aka the Onion Knight from Dark Souls, but the silliness of having a literal pot of soup for a head makes him feel more like a Zelda character. If Nintendo was willing to somewhat tarnish their family-friendly reputation by calling a character Pothead. This also serves to highlight the themes of fear and death present in the story. A lot of fiction displays the idea of living forever as something scary, horrible, and monstrous. But Death's Door takes the idea of living forever and frames it as something both melancholically tragic and comedically absurd. The story of this character is that they were experimented on and someone turned his head into a pot to try and find a cure for death. I won't spoil the who and the why, but just think about how absurd that is. Someone in this game's world earnestly thought to themselves, you know what's preferable to dying? Having a pot of soup for a head. And apparently they never stopped and realized how utterly crazy that sounds. This kind of thing is the main appeal of Death's Door. You're going on a journey exploring this world, learning its mysteries, and meeting its colorful cast of characters. It makes for an enjoyable and lighthearted little adventure. The game's art style and excellent soundtrack helps to give each location in the world its own distinct personality. A standout example is the Inner Furnace level, where the piston platforms in the floor will move in time with the music. After getting your first assignment and leaving the Hall of Doors, you go to the Grove of Spirits. This is the tutorial area where you'll learn the basics of combat before quickly moving on to the first fight of the game, which is technically also the first boss fight. It's not a particularly hard boss fight, but that's because it's a tutorial boss that mainly exists to help players get acclimated to the controls. After defeating the demonic forest spirit, the next area the players will go to is the Lost Cemetery. This is when the game starts to show its true colors. The inspirations from Dark Souls and The Legend of Zelda don't just stop at the story and characters. It can also be found in the level design somewhat. Specifically old school Zelda games for the Super Nintendo, where exploration is based more or less around rudimentary puzzle solving and utility-gated progression. Levels in Death's Door are mostly linear. They just feel more open than they really are because they'll often loop around in on themselves, allowing players to open up well-placed shortcuts which reward exploration and help cut down on some of the repetition through backtracking, so as to encourage further exploration. There's also a hub area that connects all the locations in the world together through unlockable fast travel points, encouraging players to revisit locations they already searched and explore even further. Even after completing the main story, there's also plenty of hidden secrets to discover for players who explore thoroughly, including currency you can use to upgrade your character, optional bosses and mini-bosses, some new weapons, a few power-ups, quest items, and collectible items that expand on the lore of the game's story and universe. Collectible items in this game are called shiny things, which are displayed in the menu. The shiny things have item descriptions that actually help provide some lore to the world, same as the Souls series. It's also not something totally superfluous that doesn't have anything to do with the events going on in the main story. The shiny things are also placed around in the world in ways that make sense logically if you're paying attention. You don't need to pick up all the shiny things and read into the item descriptions to understand what's happening in the story either. If you're paying attention to the main story, you'll understand what's going on. The shiny things will actually help add on to the understanding of what's happening, which is exactly how stuff like this should work. The only thing I would have liked to have seen is the shiny things having more utility in the game itself. Only 2 or 3 shiny things are ever used in the game as quest items. The most standout example is this chessboard puzzle in the Estate of the Urnwitch. The answer to this puzzle can only be found by going into Ceramic Manor and finding a shiny thing hidden in a secret room. What's more is you need to actually observe the shiny thing in your menu after you find it to figure out the solution. The puzzles in Death's Door aren't particularly hard. The hardest puzzles in the game are some of the optional ones, like this gate with a riddle written on a plaque by the stranded sailor. To solve this puzzle, you just need to read the riddle and use your inductive-deductive skills to figure it out. Most of the puzzles are focused on timing and making the player feel smart and observant, instead of actually challenging them to be smart and observant. The puzzles in the Zelda games have a problem with this as well. I could go into more detail on this, but that would lead into a whole diatribe about my feelings on puzzles in games in general, which is a separate issue entirely. Thankfully, the game has other ways to reward players for being observant of their surroundings, like when it uses the isometric camera to hide secret areas. An observant player may randomly notice something like the top of a ladder sticking out over a wall that's facing away from the camera. In other games that have isometric cameras like this, going behind an object would usually just show the silhouette of the player character through the geometry. But in Death's Door, the isometric camera will actually swing around, giving a full view of the area. There are actually a few areas like this in the game. If there's somewhere that looks like you can go behind the geometry in the level, try doing that. You may be pleasantly surprised by what you'll find. Other than that, there's also the utility gated off areas that are only accessible after you get the necessary piece of equipment. First off, you'll get the flame spell, then the bomb spell, and finally the hook shot spell. The hook shot spell is probably the most straightforward of the three, since you can only use it on specific anchor points that are mostly really easy to spot, because they all look the same and have a red piece of cloth tied to them. The bomb spell requires a little more thought to use, because the walls glowing with cracks that you can blow up can be surprisingly easy to miss sometimes. But if you know to be on the lookout for them, they're pretty easy to notice. The flame spell is the one that requires the most thought from the player because it has more than one use for getting around the environment. The two things it's mostly used for are burning away cobwebs that are blocking off an area and lighting braziers that act as switches to open doors. That's another thing. In Death's Door, unlit braziers are almost always switches to activate something. Sometimes it's a door, sometimes it's a secret area. So if you find one, try lighting it on fire and see what happens. The only part of the Metroidvania-style exploration that the developers kinda dropped the ball on has to do with these metal plates on the ground. You'll find these everywhere in the game world, just like the anchor points for the hookshot. And at first, I thought I needed to find another spell to interact with them. But no, you're supposed to do a ground pound on them. Once you do that, the camera will move from the isometric perspective to top down. Then the player will be able to see the silhouette of the character through the floor as they move through these underground tunnels to get to the other side. It's not like it's a labyrinth or anything, it's always just a tunnel with a straight shot to the other side. Most of the challenge with these metal plates is just spotting them and figuring out where in the environment you're supposed to drop down from to ground pound on them. The problem with these metal plates is that at no point does the game tell you that this is what you're supposed to do with them. Also, at no point does the game tell you that you can even do a ground pound. After I completed the main story, I still couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do with these things, so I just ended up looking it up online. To ground pound, you need to drop off a ledge and press the attack button. I don't know how the players were supposed to figure this out by themselves exactly. There is this one area near the beginning in the cemetery where there's an enemy waiting at the bottom of a ledge the player needs to drop down. But you don't need to do a ground pound on them to get down there. I guess the game is asking the player to put 2 and 2 together, but every other attack in the game was introduced via tutorial prompts, even the basic attack. Even Dark Souls made sure to have some text to tell the players they could do a plunging attack. Death's Door doesn't have a jump button, so you can't perform a ground pound in the middle of combat, and it's not like you have a lot of instances of enemies waiting for you at the bottom of ledges so you can ground pound on them. So interacting with these metal plates is really the only use the ground pound has in the game. But still, it would have been nice if the game told me I could do that without needing to look it up. As for the combat itself, it's probably the game's weakest link. It's mostly just rudimentary and serviceable. You have a basic attack, a charged heavy attack, a dodge roll, a rolling slam attack, and a few ranged options, such as your bow and your other 3 spells that you can switch between on the fly. You can also upgrade all 4 spells by defeating 4 hidden bosses in the game. The hookshot can be used to grapple on enemies as well as anchor points, and upgrading it allows you to slash enemies when you zip over to them. The upgraded flame spell will do burn damage over time, and upgrading the bomb spell makes it so you don't take splash damage from your own explosions. The upgraded bow spell makes it so you have the option between a bow that fires quick volleys or an extra powerful charged shot. You can also buy upgrades for your character in exchange for currency, which in this game is soul energy. You gain soul energy by either killing enemies or finding these pink orbs scattered around the world. The character upgrades you can buy from the shop are pretty standard. Strength increases the damage you do with your melee weapon and the reach of your swings. Dexterity lessens the time between swings and decreases the time it takes you to charge your attacks. Haste decreases your dodge roll cooldown, makes your dodges faster, and increases your base movement speed. And magic increases the damage done with your spells. There are a few different weapons that you can find while exploring to mix up the combat a little more. 5 in total, including the basic sword that you start off with, and they all have different stats that you can see in the menu. There's the Reaper's Sword, which is the base weapon you start out with. Then there's the discarded Umbrella, which is mostly a gag weapon you can pick up near the start of the game. It even says in the item description that it's not very good, and there's even an achievement for beating the whole game with it, which I'm pretty sure is just the developer's way of trolling the players. Then there's the Rogue Daggers, the Thunder Hammer, and the Reaper's Greatsword. But the Reaper's Greatsword is the best weapon in the whole game, and the reason why is obvious when looking at the weapon stats. The Thunder Hammer is just a worse version of the Greatsword. The basic attack for both the hammer and the Greatsword have a 1-2 striking combo, which means you can swing the weapon twice before the attack sequence resets itself. They also take the same amount of time to swing, but the Greatsword does slightly more damage and has slightly more range. The Umbrella has the same stats as the base sword, except it only does half the amount of damage. So all that's left is the Greatsword, the daggers, and the Reaper's Sword. It seems that the daggers should be the opposite of the Greatsword. The daggers have a maximum combo of 6, whereas the Greatsword only has 2. So clearly the daggers are fast weapons that deal very little damage, whereas the Greatsword is a slow weapon that deals in a lot of damage, with the basic sword sitting somewhere in between, right? Well, no. Assuming the stats in the menus are correct, when doing the math, the daggers and the Greatsword actually deal roughly the same amount of damage per second and per completed combo. So the Greatsword and the daggers are mostly tied in total damage dealt. The thing that puts the Greatsword ahead of the daggers and subsequently the base sword is range, having almost double the range of the daggers. The superior range of the Greatsword makes it the best choice for both one-on-one encounters and groups of enemies alike. But to be honest, that's only in the micro details. All of the weapons mostly feel the same. There's not a lot of depth or complexity to the combat. It's not like you can do complex combos and seamlessly chain different moves together. There's also no blocking, parrying, or dynamic weapon switching. But I would like to point out that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I've been playing through more of the games in the Soulsborne and the Legend of Zelda series recently. I know this statement is probably going to make some people mad at me, but as far as I can tell, neither the Zelda games or the Souls games seem to have very deep or complex combat systems either. In Dark Souls 1, the combat by itself is only okay. Almost every boss battle in most Souls games tends to amount to dodge rolling away from their attacks and spanking them in the ass with your weapon of choice. It doesn't matter what class you choose or what weapon you use, you will be dodge rolling and slapping the bosses in the ass most of the time. But the combat is only one facet of gameplay in Dark Souls. What elevates the gameplay beyond just okay is good RPG mechanics and good level design. The Zelda games are harder to pin down because combat is sometimes vastly different between each entry in the series, but that seems to generally be the case for them too. However, the combat usually tends to dovetail with the better parts of Zelda games quite well, namely the dungeon crawling, questing, and exploring. The difference is the combat in most Zelda games tends to be thoroughly broken up by multiple different elements. What Death's Door excels at the most is fostering a sense of adventure through its soundtrack, visuals, and writing. It makes you eager to explore this world and see all it has to offer. While you're exploring, you'll be discovering artifacts, visiting exotic locations, and meeting new and enjoyable characters, which is all great. What you'll be doing in between that is the actual gameplay, which isn't as enjoyable. Instead of having exploration be broken up by a wide variety of interesting challenges and activities, it's broken up mainly by combat encounters and looking for secrets. Most of the secrets are character upgrades, which ultimately neither improve the combat very much or tell us anything substantive about the world. You'll be spending more time in combat and hunting for upgrades than you will be doing anything else while exploring the world. The only reason hunting for upgrades is enjoyable at all is because to get to most of them, you need to complete different types of puzzle challenges of varying difficulty. The act of looking for secrets and character upgrades is probably the most enjoyable part of the gameplay. Getting the actual upgrades, however, made the game more enjoyable for the wrong reasons. Because making my character stronger meant that any combat encounters I found myself in would end quicker. That way, I could get back to the parts of the game that were actually enjoyable, which is exploring and looking for stuff while tackling the main story. Death's Door is a fun game, but that is in spite of its underwhelming combat. It's an action-adventure game that's good at the adventure part of the tag, but not so much the action. which is unfortunate because combat makes up about half the total gameplay. Oftentimes, it feels as though the developers thought to themselves, we need to challenge the players in some way while they're exploring the world we created. But if we can't figure out how to make the challenge interesting, let's just lock them in a room and spawn some enemies for them to fight instead. Which wouldn't be a bad thing if the combat required more skill, or if it had more interesting things alongside it like Zelda and Dark Souls does. But for the most part, it doesn't. This is probably why Castle Lockstone is my favorite level in the game. It requires more puzzle solving to get through it than any of the others, and the puzzles themselves have more moving parts, thus breaking up the combat and mixing up the flow of exploration. They could have done more to shake up the combat without needing to drastically overhaul it, like adding dynamic weapon switching so you can switch to different weapons on the fly, or maybe changing up the arenas themselves a bit more by adding more hazards. Some of the areas do this already. Instead of being just an empty box, some of them will have hazards under them with a few holes in the middle. Or instead of walls, the edges of the arena will have bottomless pits. It's better than nothing, but not exactly innovative, nothing special there. This arena with a water hazard under it and sections of the floor that crumble away is more interesting. The only permanent flooring has enemies that like to jump around on them, and there's anchor points on either side. So that way the players can go to the other side of the arena if they end up getting stranded. So there's a motivation to kill all the enemies as fast as possible, and to not waste all your magic so you can use your hookshot spell. Another good example is this arena with hazardous flooring covered in ice, which causes the player to slide around the arena, making it harder to aim your spells since there isn't a lock-on mechanic. Arenas like these make relying on spamming spells and spamming dodge roll a little more impractical, so you need to be more thoughtful in your approach. Don't get me wrong, the enemies here offer plenty of variety. Enemies will either have close or ranged attacks, and sometimes both. Some enemies will fire slow-moving projectiles at you that you can knock back at them, like these purple things that look suspiciously like the pose from Zelda. Some enemies will teleport around the arena, some will jump and zip around the arena, some enemies will be stationary and won't move, essentially acting as sentry turrets. Some enemies will suicide charge you, some will have area of effect attacks the player needs to watch out for, and some of the AoE attacks will either damage the player right away, or they'll only cause damage if they remain in the affected area. There's plenty of variety in the enemies, but that ends up being for naught because of your limited options in combat. Here's a pro tip when trying to understand the strengths and weaknesses of a game's combat system. The best place to start looking at first isn't combos, or how many weapons you get, or how the weapons feel, or how cool you look when killing enemies. It's your health. The health system tends to almost always be ground zero for understanding a combat system. That's because health systems are usually the anchor game developers use to make sure the combat is both fair and balanced. The more restrictive a health system is, the more tight and responsive the combat needs to be to compensate. Otherwise, frustration will set in quickly. This was my biggest problem with Titan Souls. The one-hit kill nature of the health system was extremely strict, and combat wasn't anywhere as responsive as it needed to be for it to feel fair and balanced. There are 2 meters at the top of the screen. One displays your health, and the other is magic. Your magic meter drains each time you use a spell, and the way you refill it is by hitting things with your weapon. Not just enemies either. You can regain magic by hitting things in the environment too. Some puzzles in the game will require you to use your spells to progress, so the game will lay items around in the immediate area that respawn a short while after you hit them. These are here to refill your magic meter in case you drain it, so that way players won't get stuck when trying to progress through an area. This is a good example of what I meant when I was saying the puzzles are more interested in making the players feel smart as opposed to asking them to be smart. Both of these meters can be upgraded as well by finding shrines and getting crystals of vitality and crystals of magic. You need to get 4 crystals for both magic and vitality to permanently increase both meters by 1 pip. You start out with 4 pips for both health and magic, which can be increased to a maximum of 6 each. Which doesn't seem like much, but since there's no way to heal mid-combat, every little bit of extra health goes a long way. The only way to heal without returning to the hub world is by finding life seeds and planting them in these pots to grow consumable soul fruit. Since there's no way to heal mid-combat, it's best that players try to avoid damage whenever possible. This is of course true for every game with combat, but usually those games would either provide you with a way to heal yourself on the fly, or provide more options to damage the enemies, or provide more options to avoid being damaged yourself. During the regular enemy encounters, if you get hurt, you can just find a pot with some soul fruit in it, or find a life seed and an empty pot to plant it in. But that requires you to either backtrack through the level to find some, or just press on until you run into some. When the game locks the player in a room and throws either a boss or waves of enemies at them, which happens a lot, they have no way of knowing how many waves of enemies will spawn in. So the go-to strategy is to keep your distance by dodge rolling away and using your spells to attack the enemies at range. When your magic meter is empty, get some hits in with your main weapon to refill it. That's how all the combat encounters tend to go. Run over to an enemy or group of enemies, bait them into attacking you, dodge roll out of the way as they try to hit you, then either lob some spells at them or run back over to them and hit them a few times. Rinse and repeat for every single combat encounter with little to no changes. Ideally, do this with the Great Sword and the upgraded bomb spell when you get them, because the splash damage makes the bomb spell the best choice for damaging multiple enemies at once. This is the optimal strategy for every single fight in the game because it's the best one for players to keep themselves safe and deal with waves of enemies. If you try to fight the enemies in any other way, you'll almost always take damage. The main challenge in these arena battles, as well as most of the combat encounters, including the bosses, is to be patient and not take any risks. When I died during combat encounters in Death's Door, most of the time it was either because I was trying a different strategy than the one I laid out, or it was because I was having trouble paying attention to what was happening. I would often zone out in combat, because endlessly spamming the dodge roll button until the window for me to go on the offensive comes up isn't interesting enough to keep my attention. When I zone out, I lose focus, and sometimes I would dodge roll straight into an enemy attack. So really, the only reason combat in Death's Door was challenging for me at all was because it was so boring that I was stuck between struggling to care about what's happening and wanting the combat encounter to end a little quicker by seeing if I can get an extra attack or two in before I had to start rolling away again. As for the bosses, fighting them tends to mostly be the same idea. Black Knight mini-bosses are a particular example. They have one attack total. A combo of 3 where they try to hit you with a downward swing. The best strategy here is to get close, dodge roll the combo, hit them a few times, then go back to dodge rolling. Do this over and over again until the enemy is dead. The window for the anticipation phase can have slightly different timings between each swing, but that's it. This works in Dark Souls because of the stamina system. In Death's Door, there is no stamina system, so there's no reason not to spam dodge roll. It's fine the first time, but needing to defeat a boss in basically the same way you defeat most other enemies in the game gets old quickly. The hidden bosses that guard the spell upgrades are called Silent Servants. They offer a bit more variety because unlike the Black Knights, they have more than just one attack. But the tactic for beating them is the same. The hardest one by far is the one guarding the fire spell because of these little fireballs flying around the boss. You take damage if you dodge roll into them, but you need to dodge roll around to avoid getting hit. This makes it so you can't just dodge roll in any direction you want. You need to be careful not to run into the fireballs. This turns the act of dodge rolling into an actual challenge. But the tactics for fighting them are still the same. You just need to be a bit more mindful when dodging. The most difficult bosses are the 6 main bosses in the story. The 2 hardest ones are the final boss and the one you face in Castle Lockstone, because their attack patterns are the most erratic and their hitboxes are relatively wide, making them more difficult to dodge. I won't spoil the main bosses in the game because that would require me to spoil some of the story. But I will say this, there are 2 achievements that you can get in the game during 2 of the boss fights. They're called Meal for a King and Hot Pot. The way you get these 2 achievements rewards the player for trying to be clever. Of course, when you learn how to get them, it turns the bosses into total pushovers, especially Meal for a King. But the point is they add an extra quirk to the boss fights that reward you for being clever. I wish the other bosses in the game had stuff like this. I'll also say that I was a bit disappointed that the game's secret ending didn't have a super challenging boss fight like Acid Nerve's previous game did. It did have a boss fight, but it was nowhere near the most challenging one. The game clearly wants you to get the secret ending, if the cutscene after the end credits is anything to go by. The developers have even said that the secret ending is the true ending to the game's story. There are a few things to help nudge you to try and find it and 100% the game, like the big old % on the load screen when you want to continue a game, for instance. The fast travel system is the game's attempt at streamlining this process. The Hall of Doors acts as the hub for most of the game. From here, the player can fast travel to any part of the game world through any of the doors, provided they've activated the door first, of course. After beating the main story, the fast travel doors will glow red if there are still secrets in the areas they lead to. If you found everything in the area, they glow white. The glowing red doors make it clear that the developers want the players to just use the fast travel system to get around the game world, especially when revisiting locations to explore and mop up any remaining secrets. Before I start laboring on this point, let me quickly explain the difference between a hub and an overworld. The hub is essentially the player's base of operations. You go there to save your game, upgrade your character, talk to NPCs, and etc. A good example of this is the Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls. An overworld is an area that exists to be the center of the game world and connects all the important locations together. A good example of this is Hyrule Field in The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. While a hub has multiple important uses and is essentially the player's base of operations, it's not necessarily the center of the game world. Getting to it may be an inconvenience if it's a little out of the way. For something to qualify as an overworld, it only needs to serve one purpose, which is connecting all the important locations together. Unfortunately, this usually results in the overworld feeling like it's only there to act as padding, as the players only traverse the space in order to get somewhere interesting. After you complete the main story, the Hall of Doors will be abandoned by all the NPCs, and the upgrade shop will be permanently moved to another location. At that point, it's arguably not even fair to call the Hall of Doors a hub area anymore since it gains less utility. There are some interesting things to find in the Hall of Doors, but once you pick them up, the location just becomes padding. It doesn't help that all the fast travel doors look the same and will be placed in locations scattered all over the Hall of Doors. So if I wanted to go to the Flooded Fortress, I need to remember where the Flooded Fortress door is, or I need to walk over to a door to read the text that appears at the top. When I was playing through the main story and going around discovering new locations, I was always relieved when I found one of those glowing pink keyholes. Because not only did it mean I could save my game, but it meant I could go back to the Hall of Doors and purchase upgrades at the shop if I could afford to. After completing the main story and activating all the doors in every location, the fast travel doors as well as the Hall of Doors became one of my least favorite parts of the game, because it made going from one location to another tedious and boring. For example, if I wanted to go from the Lost Cemetery straight to the Flooded Fortress, I would need to go to the fast travel door, walk through it, wait through a loading screen so the game can load in the Hall of Doors, go from one side of this big empty space to another, go to the area where the door to the Flooded Fortress is, walk over to each door in the area to make the text at the top of the screen appear, read each line of text until I find the door I want, then go through it and wait through another loading screen as the game loads in the Flooded Fortress. The whole time I was doing this, it made me wish that I could just select the place I wanted to go from a conventional menu, since it would have been far easier and faster. Plus, when you're trying to get everything, you have no way of knowing if you found everything in the area until you go back to the Hall of Doors. When I was trying to 100% the game, there were a few times when I would go to an area with a red door, look around for a while, find something I missed, go back to the Hall of Doors thinking I found everything, and saw the door was still red, which means there was something else in the area and I just missed it, forcing me to go back through and keep looking. And going back through a level can have its own problems. The level design in Death's Door is good on a level-by-level basis. The secrets and unlockable shortcuts go a long way to make the player feel like they're being rewarded for exploring. There are very few dead ends, and the few areas that have dead ends almost always seem to have something worthwhile at the end of them anyway. So no matter where you're going, as long as it's somewhere new, you're always exploring and making progress. But even though the level design is good on a micro level, on a macro level, problems start to crop up, especially when going back through the levels later to do secret hunting. There's no map or anything. Instead, there are signposts scattered around the levels that point towards different level transition points and a few landmarks. I like how you can slash one of these signs and half of what it says gets cut off, and I like that the game later implies a narrative reason why they're there. But you don't see them all that frequently, and this combined with a few other things resulted in me getting lost a few times. This isn't so bad in most areas, but I did get lost a few times when trying to find my way around the Lost Cemetery and the Forest Settlement. I'm glad the game doesn't just hold your hand the whole time you're playing. It seems to want players to use their heads at least a little. But the levels in Death's Door aren't structured the same way the levels in Dark Souls are. You can arrive at Firelink's Shrine from the Undead Asylum and go straight to the cemetery. Going there at the start of the game will likely result in you getting killed because the skeletons in the cemetery are much higher level than you are at the start. Dark Souls is filled with areas that are soft bricked with higher level enemies. It's up to the player to decide when and if they're ready to fight the enemies in these areas. Death's Door doesn't have anything like that. Instead, it's structured more like a Zelda game, where access to new areas is usually lock and key based. You either find the key or switch to open the door, use the necessary piece of equipment to proceed, or kill all the enemies before proceeding. Even in the beginning, when the player is told they need to go to 3 different areas to collect 3 different souls, 2 of those areas will be locked off. There's been a world map in every Zelda game since The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. That's because Nintendo recognized that these games were getting so big that it was no longer reasonable to expect the average player to just memorize the layout. If Death's Door is only going to give you one path forward anyway, then there's not much of a reason to not just add in a map. Especially since the maze-like layout of the levels combined with the isometric camera makes them hard to navigate at times. Because the camera is facing down at the ground, you can't look off in the distance to see if there's a place up ahead you can go. So the best way to navigate a lot of these levels is to just look around and try to remember if you've been there before. Which is a problem because some of the levels are labyrinthian, and combining secret areas, multiple pathways, and unlockable shortcuts, it can sometimes be hard to figure out where you're going. This wasn't an issue for me when I was doing the main story, because seeing a gate that's closed or a shortcut that isn't activated is a pretty good indication that you haven't been in that area before. But when going back to search these areas later for more secrets, it started to become a problem for me. I think they probably should have added a map of some kind. Also, they could have made the game truly open-ended and let the players tackle the main objective of retrieving the 3 giant souls in whatever order they feel like. Most of the things you'll be finding while exploring will be stuff to make your character more powerful, with the only exception being shiny things. Because of this, players are mechanically incentivized to explore the world as much as they can before completing the main story, so that way they can get the most use out of their character upgrades. because as I said, the bosses in the main story are the most difficult enemies in the game. And there's no new game plus where you can carry your upgraded weapons and equipment over to a new playthrough. But the fast travel doors in the Hall of Doors don't turn red until after you finish the main story. I suppose the devs want you to play the story and then occasionally go off the beaten path to explore and find some secrets. Then, after you complete the main story, you can go back and look for all the things you missed. But there are plenty of people who will play straight through the story and then go do side content afterwards. That's what I did on my first playthrough. I played through the story and did some exploring here and there. After I got the flame spell and the bomb spell, I went back to one of the levels to explore some of the areas that were previously inaccessible. But while I was exploring, I realized I still didn't have the equipment I needed to interact with these red things. Normally, Metroidvania games have you going back through the same areas multiple times to complete an objective. Most of the areas on the map never really get left behind. That's not the case in Death's Door. Once you go through an area for the main story, you never need to go through it again unless you want to. The only level that's an exception to this is the Lost Cemetery. You only need to go back through the other levels if you're going for the secret ending. So I figured instead of exploring as much as I can with the equipment I have and trying to remember that this area is here, I'll just wait until I get all the equipment I need to explore everything. That way, I can get everything in one go without needing to backtrack through the same levels over and over again each time I get a new piece of gear. Eventually, I got the hook shot and did some exploring with it. But I still waited to do most of the exploring because I was still waiting for the piece of equipment I thought I needed to interact with these metal plates on the floor, because the game never explained that I was supposed to ground pound on them. Also, they're scattered around everywhere like the anchor points for the hook shot. Honestly, at first I thought these things were teleportation pads or something. So I thought the game was going to give me another piece of equipment to use on them if I just kept playing the story. When I beat the main story, I saw I still didn't have a new piece of equipment that could let me interact with those plates. So I was like, what gives? I explored with the tools that I had, hoping the game would eventually tell me what I was supposed to do with them, until I just gave up and looked it up online. That's when I learned I was supposed to ground pound on them. That's also when I learned I could ground pound. So I went back through the levels until I got all the metal plates I missed when I was exploring them earlier. Also, eventually I figured out all the things I needed to do to get the secret ending. Some of the tasks the game wants you to do to get the secret ending are a bit obscure, but it never enters the territory of moon logic, thankfully. You don't need to do literally everything to get the secret ending, but you probably will anyway. The game doesn't tell you there's a secret ending. The only way you can know there is one is if you look it up online or watch a video like this one. The only way to figure out that there are tasks you need to do to get the secret ending is to make all of the doors in the Hall of Doors stop glowing red by looking for everything. That's why I was disappointed that the secret ending didn't have a big challenging boss fight like Titan Souls did, because I was spending all that time looking for character upgrades. But to what end? Making my character stronger would be a good enough incentive to try and find everything by itself if the combat was more enjoyable. But with combat that's only ever serviceable and no challenging enemies to fight, you're really just trying to make the percent counter on the load screen say 100%. You're completing everything for the sake of completing everything. If the game world was structured more like a proper Metroidvania, where players never leave most of the map behind, maybe this wouldn't be as much of an issue. Because if the game was designed more like a proper Metroidvania, they would need to pass through the same levels again to beat the game anyway. So they may as well do some exploring with their new equipment while they're there. Then after they beat the story, they can use the red fast travel doors to mop up the remaining 10% or 20% of the things they missed. Then they'll discover that there's more secrets and more mysteries to solve. But because of things like the fast travel doors telling you if you found everything by glowing red, the way the game dolls out equipment so you can explore even more, how the levels are structured, and the lack of a map making it easy to get lost, Death's Door incentivizes players to explore and secret hunt after completing the main story. That way, they can do it all in one go. But most secrets in the game are upgrades that make your character stronger in combat, and the most challenging fights in the game are in the main story. So you're actually better off finding as many secrets and upgrades as possible before beating the main story, by backtracking through the same levels over and over again, multiple times, each time you're given a new piece of gear, trying not to get lost or wander into secret areas you already found when you were searching last time. Ideally, there should be more overlap between the most convenient way to play and the most sensible way to play. As it stands, they're both diametrically opposed to each other. Because of all these problems, when you strip away the things this game does well, the characters, world building, soundtrack, and the art direction, what you're left with is a mostly generic Metroidvania light and an obtuse-feeling collectathon game with generally underwhelming combat and a few puzzles. If I knew I wasn't going to get much out of 100%ing the game, I probably would have stopped playing before seeing the secret ending. Normally, I wouldn't harp on about post-game content this much, because usually that kind of thing is only for completionists. But to get the game's true ending, you're probably gonna have to do almost everything, unless you get lucky or you just look up a guide or something. So the game should have made getting everything, if not easier or more convenient, then at least more rewarding, either narratively or mechanically. The chef at the Stranded Sailor will give you some hints to help push you into looking for some of the secrets you may have missed. But other than that, the things that Death's Door does to try and push its players to keep exploring post-game offer their own inconveniences for doing so. Because of this, I wager a lot of people are just gonna beat the main story, explore a little, get bored, and just quit before seeing the real ending to the game. Which is a shame, because lack of a good boss fight aside, when you do eventually find the true ending, it's a good and satisfying way to wrap up the adventure in a nice little bow. And that is Death's Door. It's a fun, lighthearted little adventure with an appealing art style and an excellent soundtrack. Its story, characters, and world building are probably the most enjoyable parts of the whole experience. It's good at cultivating this sense of boundless adventure the old school Zelda games were good at cultivating. Exploring the game's world is enjoyable, for the most part, unless you beat the story before doing any exploring. In that case, it might feel as though the game overstayed its welcome in hindsight if you're not a completionist. If you decide to pick it up, I recommend maybe playing through the main story and occasionally taking a break by doing some exploring. Then, after you beat the story and get tired of exploring, you might be better off just putting the game down and looking up the true ending online rather than finding it yourself. And if you insist on finding it yourself anyway, there's no shame in consulting a guide. I know it seems like I was a little harsh towards Death's Door in this video. It's an okay game overall. It's worth experiencing, but not anything mind-blowing. I also know a lot of people really like this game. It ended up at the top of a lot of people's Game of the Year lists for 2021. But I think that just shows how much of a slow year for gaming 2021 really was. Acid Nerve clearly had a vision for Death's Door and executed that vision competently. And the fact that this was made with a development team that mainly consisted of 2 people is impressive, which I suppose is the point I want to end this video on. At first, I was wondering whether or not to even make this video at all, because I couldn't go into detail on the things I liked most about Death's Door without going into spoilers. Also, I didn't feel as though there was much I could say about the story and characters that you couldn't get from just playing the game yourself. But, on the other hand, a spoiler-free video may come out sounding a bit like I'm trashing the game, even though I like it. After thinking about it, I realized it may not matter all that much. I thought Titan Souls felt like it was being held back by the developer's desire to pay homage to other games they liked. Death's Door also feels like it's being held back, but instead of feeling like it's limited by its desire to emulate a much better game, it feels like it's limited by its small two-man development team. A lot of the problems I pointed out in this video honestly feel like the result of this game being made by only 2 people. No matter how ambitious a project is, 2 people can only do so much. Maybe if they hired more people, these problems could have been solved. Death's Door is an okay game, and I can't help but feel as though the reason it isn't a truly good or great game is because it didn't have all the help it needed to reach its full potential. If the context of the secret ending is anything to go by, Acid Nerve seems to be interested in making another video game at some point. And with the massive success of Death's Door, they have the money to expand and bring on more people. So hopefully their next game won't feel like it's being held back from reaching its full potential. But I guess we'll see when and if that happens. Hey, I'm finally doing it! Way back at the end of one of these videos, like I think a year or 2 ago, I said I wanted to start uploading videos once every month. Well, finally I uploaded a video in 1 month and then uploaded another video the next month. I finally got around to doing that. Took me a little while, but I finally did it. Let's see if we can shoot for 3. Like I said in my previous video, my next couple of videos were gonna be short game reviews. I'm not sure how many more I'm going to do, maybe 1 more, maybe 2, possibly 3, we'll have to see about that. But after that, I'm going to move on to my next analysis video. So I'm going to keep this end segment short and move on to the next review, and hopefully I'll see you sometime next month. Anyway, thank you all for watching! Oh! If you liked this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video.